was first passed. Our firm, some of you may know Reggie Jones, originally represented AIA Virginia. And when I joined the firm about 12 years ago, I started representing AIA. So I've been on board for the past 12 years, representing the interests of not only AIA, but our partner organization, the American Council of Engineering Companies. And that's a photo of me. This is a couple of sessions ago. I think this was the 2020 session, right before COVID, and presenting a bill on limiting duty to defend clauses in public contracts, which we were able to get passed. And this is Senator Scott Surrevell, who is, I guess, to my left, if you're looking at that photo.
Hey, Patrick.
Yep.
I noticed that Senator Surrevell to your left, eyes are closed, falling asleep. Lady behind you, eyes closed, falling asleep. Guy behind her, eyes closed, falling asleep. And our friend Tom Lisk, eyes closed, falling asleep. It must have been a riveting presentation.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, there's a little meme that goes around with lobbyists every year that, it's like what my parents think I do. And, it's, at the steps of the U.S. Capitol, what my friends think I do, which is, drink and eat food all day, and, what the public thinks I do. And it's like somebody clubbing a baby seal. But really what a lobbyist does is attend a ton of meetings. Most people are half awake, as you can see in this photo. But a substantial portion of what we do are attending meetings and presenting at meetings. And just very quickly about me, both Dave and I are attorneys at Williams Mullen. We're a law firm based in Richmond. We've got about 230 attorneys spread through Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. My background is I started as an attorney working for the General Assembly, spent 5 years there as a staff attorney, drafting legislation, doing policy research, and then joined Williams Mullen. I've been here for 12 years, or I guess a little over 11 years. And I am joined by my partner in crime, the Honorable Dave Albo. And Dave, I'll let you share your background and a little story about this photo.
Right. It always cracks me up when people use my title honorable, because I know my fraternity brothers laugh their faces off when they hear it. So my background is that I was in the Virginia House of Delegates representing southern tip of Fairfax County from 1994 until my retirement in 2017. And this picture is a picture of my retirement when I announced that I was retiring after 24 years of service, undefeated and unindicted. And then I did a mic drop. You can't see the mic drop, but it's dropping out of my left hand. I was chairman of the Courts of Justice Committee for 12 years and found out that I am the longest serving chairman of the Courts of Justice Committee in the 400+ year history of Virginia, which is kind of cool if you think about it. But then I always note that life expectancy in the 1700s is only about 30 years old. So adjusted for life expectancy, 12 years is not really that big a deal. And then when I retired in 2017, your lobbyist, Bill Axel, who was preparing to retire, called me up and asked me to join. And so here I am helping you guys.
And Dave, I'll make an observation about this photo, and I can see 9. This is a photo. You have some of your Republican caucus members in the background, and I'm just going to point out the faces that are directly lit up. There are 9 Republican legislators sitting here. And this photo was what, 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, 5 years ago, right?
Okay, so 5 years ago. So of the 9 legislators pictured here, only 3 of them are still in the General Assembly. And I guess 10, if you count yourself included, the 10 Republican legislators, only 3 are left. So when I look and when we look at the representation of our clients and AIA specifically, one of the things that we do as lobbyists and what our advocacy is really about is educating legislators about what architects do, how you contribute to society, what laws, rules, and regulations pertain to the practice of your profession. And we have such a rapid turnover in the General Assembly. So in the 5 years since this photo, there's only 3 out of 10 left. We are constantly having to educate. So we're lobbyists, but we are really educators first and foremost. So we do that on behalf of your profession. And one of the tools that we use to educate is leveraging the membership of AIA. And that's why, for those of you who are participating today, thank you. Because, Dave and I and Corey and Ria and the rest of the folks at AIA are the tip of the spear. The bulk of that spear sits behind us, and that's the AIA membership. And this is another photo from the 2020 session where we had AIA and ACEC recognized on the floor of the House of Delegates and the Senate of Virginia. And so if you squint and look very closely, you see a slightly younger Corey Claiborne in these photos. And we have membership for both AIA and ACEC. So that was a quick intro, but the bulk of this presentation, we're going to talk about why we advocate on behalf of the industry and the importance of advocacy within really any profession. A little bit about General Assembly 101. We want you to be familiar with the terminology, with the process of how a bill becomes a law, and also key tips for meeting with legislators. And these are gained from experiences that I've had as a lobbyist, that Dave has had as both a lobbyist and a legislator, and just some helpful tips on what those interactions can look like. So a little bit of the impact on the profession. And it's not every day that folks in a profession think about how they are regulated by the state. So much attention is put on things that happen from a policy and political perspective at the federal level. It really goes unnoticed how much of your day-to-day life and your regulation under the profession is governed by the state General Assembly and the executive branch of state government. And so it's at the state level where the laws and regulations pertaining to procurement and how state entities and local entities procure your services. One of the biggest issues for us is protecting qualifications-based selection, so we don't end up in a system where architects and architecture are low bid, where public entities, would hire the cheapest architect out there. That's something that we have to educate the importance of qualifications-based selection. What are the terms and conditions of how you contract with public entities? I mentioned the photo at the start of the presentation. One of the issues that we've addressed in the past were some public entities would have contract provisions that would require broad indemnification and duty to defend clauses, where if anything happens on a project, if somebody trips and falls during the construction phase of a project, that person could file suit against the construction company, against the design firm, and bring everybody into that lawsuit. And then these onerous provisions would require architecture firms in some instance to defend that public body, even though you didn't have any nexus or causality or relationship to the construction phase of the contract. So we got rid of those. How architects are licensed and who needs a license and what services can you advertise, how you are taxed. Interesting story, but the tax structure in Virginia from a sales tax perspective is almost entirely focused on the taxation of goods as they move through the economy. And the reason for that is very historical. When you go back, goods were the primary driver of the economy in Virginia, agricultural goods, manufactured goods. Well, today, the service industry is a far bigger component of the total of goods and services that move around the Commonwealth. Right now, architecture services and many other services are not taxed. We've seen proposals in the past that have sought to tax architecture services, and there are no exemptions for business-to-business transactions, and so that's something that we keep an eye on. And then finally, the reputation of your profession. We work on that with policymakers, both in the executive and legislative branches of state government, and really trying to focus on architects as being caretakers and designers of the built environment and the relationship that has with the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So those are all points of interaction that we have with state government and why we do what we do. So want to talk a little bit of some recent success that we've had. I've mentioned one of them, but just this past year, we had legislation passed and just signed by the governor that streamline how public entities use term contracts and what the dollar limits are for projects that can flow through term contracts. Prior to our legislation passing this year, term contracts that were used by public entities, depending on what type of public entity you were and what type of project you were developing or procuring, you had a different dollar limit. And it got to the point where there were probably 7 or 8 different categories of public entities that each had maybe another 2 or 3 different categories of projects. And so it became a very complicated system to manage, a very complicated system for the public and private sectors to understand. So we had legislation that streamlined that. So now all term contracts, whether you are working with a public entity that is state or a public entity that is local, all projects have the same unified dollar limits, and it's $10 million over the course of the entire term of the contract and 2.5 million cap on a per project basis. Now, obviously, those dollars can be lower. Those are just statutory caps on the contract, but we've unified that. We defeated last year, believe it or not, a bill was introduced that would have allowed the governor to grant licensure to architects without any qualifications, without any education training. It was a unilateral power of the governor to grant a license for any profession, including architecture and engineering, even if that applicant for licensure had been denied by the Apple-Sidla board. So that was something that we were able to defeat. We help ensure that architects are represented and appointed to legislative and executive study committees. We pass legislation to establish a statute of limitation on design claims by the state against design firms. And this is something that we find lots of pieces of antiquated law and policy in the Code of Virginia. And one of those is that time does not run against the king. So the king there's this theory that called sovereign immunity, that you can't sue the state government, or at least that sovereign immunity for the statute of limitations is that if something ever happens where the state finds fault in your work, the state is not bound by a statute of limitations that lets that essentially voids any claims after a certain period of time. So if, for example, if you were a firm that did work and the case was actually involving Virginia Tech, I believe it was an engineering firm where this was highlighted. If you did work 30 years ago and in next year the state found fault in your work, they could still bring a claim without us getting this legislation passed. And the Associated General Contractors were also involved in that. I've mentioned the duty to defend clause, but I'll also say that we don't just have bills that we seek to pass that we work on proactively. Every session we see a number of bills that not only do we need to either seek to get it passed or help defeat it, but we also do a lot of work to amend bills to help make sure that the impact to the profession and that the public's health, safety, and welfare are protected. So that's a short summary of some of the recent work that we've done. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit, Dave and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the terminology and how the General Assembly works. We have a part-time legislature, and this is different. A lot of people think of a legislature and they think, of course, of Congress, but our legislature in Virginia is part-time. We are the oldest continuous lawmaking body in the New World, established July 30th, 1619. We have a House of Delegates and a Senate of Virginia, 100 members of the House of Delegates. Today, we are at 52 Republicans and 48 Democrats, and the House is elected every 2 years. We are not supposed to have elections this year, but there's a pending lawsuit. The districts that were required to be redrawn based on new census data last year were not drawn in time for the election of the House of Delegates. So we right now could have an election again this fall. We're not sure yet. The Senate of Virginia, 40 members. Right now it's 21 Democrats, 19 Republicans. We will not have an election for the Senate until fall of 2023. And our lieutenant governor presides over the Senate and is really kind of acts as a 41st senator in the sense that they can make tie-breaking votes. So when you have narrow majorities in the Senate, the party of the lieutenant governor becomes very important because you end up with a higher number of ties in the Senate when you have this 19, 21, 22, 18 type of framework.
Patrick, I forget if there's a slide coming up, so this may be a repeat, but it's important to know that the legislature really only meets in the winter, January through the end of February or middle March. And they only get paid about $18,000 a year. And they have a budget for about one assistant. So this is not like Congress where they'll have a person who does defense and a person who does transportation. They've got one person, one staff person who does it all. Yeah,
exactly. That's a great segue and a reminder as you think about meeting with legislators. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But Dave, maybe you can share some of your thoughts on how part-time legislative job is.
Well, it's the main reason why I had to retire, because I was going broke by Chinese water torture. Not like I was going to lose my house, but this part-time job was taking about 40 hours a week or 30 hours a week off session, because you're dealing with different meetings. So the more senior you get, the more you'll be required to go to Richmond for off-session meetings, dealing with all the constituents, and which is the main part of your job. And then don't forget, if you're in a competitive district like I was, you have to campaign. And I was campaigning not just every other year, basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so these legislators are, and they have to hold down a regular job. And for the younger people, they have to, pay attention to their kids. So it's very overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that work in the summertime generates a lot of work for us on the lobbying side. We attend all the legislative meetings that are happening. And in fact, where we are today, by the way, in our legislative session, it adjourned in mid-March. And then the governor had the opportunity to make amendments and vetoes to bills. And we have a reconvene session where the General Assembly comes back at the end of April to vote on any final governor's amendments and vetoes on bills. But the General Assembly also didn't finish its work on time. And so what would otherwise be potentially a slower time of year for legislators, now there are a number of bills that are still in conference committee that were moved into a special session. And we also have our state budget, which has not been adopted yet, and we don't have a final draft. So, as Dave mentioned, if you are a senior legislator and you're on, for example, the Appropriations or the Senate Finance Committee, you've got to deal with that budget, and it's a very significant document. So, one of the things, obviously a core component of our advocacy work is working on legislation. And we thought it would be a good idea to talk about, how legislation gets introduced, where does it come from? And Dave, why don't you take this slide and talk a little bit about, how you had legislative ideas, what role trade associations and lobbyists played in that, in your legislative agenda.
Yeah, so I used to keep a file in my computer, and it was called, proposed bills. And whenever I had an idea, I would write it down. If a constituent came to me with a problem or an idea, I'd write it down. If lobbyists came to me, there's a problem in the industry and we need to fix X, I'd write it down. You can see there's some other sources of bills. You might have a constituent who saw something on a documentary. The professions, a lot of things come from just a real workload. I was a street lawyer in the traffic court, and often I'd find a loophole in the law and I would put it in my notes. And then this personal vendettas, that's kind of a funny way to say it, but what it really is more about is something happens to you personally as a legislator. For example, I remember Senator Warren Barry got his car towed, and then he set up a whole regulatory system for towing companies. So,
no, the best one is your resale of tickets bill.
Oh yeah, I was going to go see Iron Maiden at Jiffy Lube, and I bought tickets, and then my wife told me I had to go on a family vacation. So I tried to sell my tickets, but Jiffy Lube had this thing where you couldn't sell your tickets. You couldn't even give them away. And so that was a personal vendetta, actually, Patrick.
I know.
I passed a law that basically said when you buy a ticket, it becomes your own property. But so at any rate, I would open this file up around October before session and read all these bill ideas again. And the ones that still sounded good, I would submit them for drafting. Yeah. A lot of times in the lobbyists, like when Patrick and I bring a bill for the architects, we've written it for the legislator, but the legislators have access to a group called Division of Legislative Services, and they are all lawyers and they write bills.
Yep. So you can see it's pretty wide range of backgrounds where legislators get ideas for bills. And then DLS is where I used to work. So that legislator has a great idea. They want to prohibit a company like Ticketmaster from saying you can't sell your tickets. And then I draft the bill for legislative services, or those who are the attorneys there now. And then that kicks off the process. When the legislator gets the final version of the bill, they're happy with it, and they introduce it right before the legislative session. Now, I'm not going to read everything in this. You can go watch Schoolhouse Rock, which gives a great summary. It's still very relevant today, even though it's focused on the congressional work, but it's very similar in Virginia. The point I want to make with this slide is, even for an issue that is non-controversial, there are so many steps in our legislative process. Once that bill is introduced, it's got to go through a subcommittee in the House. Let's just say the bill's introduced in the House. Bill's got to go through a subcommittee in the House. It's got to go through the full committee in the House. Then it's got to be passed on the House floor. It can be amended at any stage in that process. If it passes the House, it's got to go back through that same process in the Senate, through subcommittee, through full committee, and then onto the Senate floor. Now, if that bill is amended in the Senate, then it's got to go back to the House, and the House has to agree to the Senate amendments. And if that happens, eventually it goes to the governor. If it doesn't happen, a new committee is formed, having members of both the House and the Senate come together in what's called a conference committee to try to work out the differences. Whether it's a conference committee bill or whether it's a bill that's passed the House and the Senate, they've agreed on it, it goes to the governor, then the governor gets the opportunity to amend or veto it. And then if the governor does that, then it comes back to the General Assembly for the General Assembly to decide whether they are going to accept or reject the governor's amendment or veto. And so that process, there are 1,000 ways to kill a bill.
Yeah.
And it's a very lengthy process.
That's right, Patrick. I wanted to point out that at every one of those steps is an opportunity for the opponents of the bill to kill the bill.
Yep.
So when you guys ask us to pass a bill, it's a long and hard process, a lot of work. When you ask us to kill a bill, we've got about 18 opportunities to try.
Yeah. Yep. And it's a long process that I just laid out. And by the way, that all happens in a long session, which we just finished. That happens in 60 days. In a short session, that happens in 45 days. So the pace of what we do once session starts is pretty incredible. I mean, Dave and I are usually in the building, 6:30, 7:30 in the morning for committee meetings. And it is not uncommon, Monday through Thursday for us to be in the building at 9, 10, or 11 o'clock at night. So we are really working around the clock from January to March. There could be committee meetings on weekends. And if we're not in a committee meeting on weekend, we're in our office catching up on everything. So very long process that happens in a very short period of time. This is just a snapshot of the committees. We often find ourselves with issues in the General Laws Committee in the House and the Senate. The House has a few more committees, and this is the list of Senate committees. But General Laws handles all the regulation of professions, including architecture. It handles all of the issues related to public procurement, which is, again, a very important issue for us. Other areas that we find ourselves on behalf of AIA, the Commerce and Labor or Commerce and Energy Committee in the House. We sometimes have bills in there. The Ag, Conservation and Natural Resources Committee will sometimes have bills in that committee. And then a lot of legislation will ultimately flow through what we call the money committees, which is the Finance and Appropriations Committee in the Senate and the House Appropriation Committee in the House. Got a couple of infographics I'm going to share, but I want to share them and point to the source, which is www.vpap.org. In Virginia, there are almost no rules related to political contributions. There's some criminal related penalties, what we call pay to play. One of the things that we don't do and that nobody does because it is a crime is hand a campaign contribution check to a legislator and say, hey, thanks for voting on House Bill 5, or, hey, I hope you'll vote for our bill next year. That is criminal. But when it comes to the amount that can be contributed, there are no limits. And so what happened is a number of years ago, a nonprofit entity formed, the Virginia Public Access Project, with the goal of helping to provide some transparency on political contributions. But it's grown to offer a lot more insight on the political process in Virginia. And so I would encourage folks who are interested to take a look at vpap.org. One of the things that, so I've got this infographic up, and what it does, it shows the increase in prevalence in party line votes. And Dave, do you want to share some of your analysis? And the recent data only goes through 2021. Right now, this is showing the House votes, and the House has actually flipped back to Republican control. But Dave, you want to share some of your perspectives on party line votes?
So what this chart means is these are bills where 100% of the Republicans voted one way and 100% of the Democrats voted the other. I can attribute this to two factors. The first factor is that when the Republicans had a 67-seat majority, there was you could go in the caucus, which is kind of a private meeting before session, and you didn't have to have everybody stick with you, because the speaker could give people a walk on some bills if they didn't want to vote the exact Republican way. So a lot of this increase in party line voting is coming about because there's a lot tighter balance between the House and the Senate, or excuse me, between Republicans and Democrats. So in the Senate, there's only a 1-seat Democrat majority, and presently the House is only a 2-seat Republican majority. The second issue is that I have noticed over my long career that it's starting to become more like United States Congress, where everything's team ball, and the leadership demands everybody vote the Democrat way, or leadership demands everyone vote the Republican way. I find that to be disturbing and kind of sad, because in Virginia, for all the years I was there, pretty much people did what they thought was best for their constituents and weren't really bound to vote with their party, except on big things like guns, abortion, and maybe taxes. So that's a disturbing trend, in my opinion, and I hope it goes away.
Yeah. So next slide, again, this doesn't capture the last legislative session. So this was the last year of Democrat control in the House. What this does is it shows you the power of control. So with AIA Virginia, and even within our firm and all of our other clients, we don't play a particular favorite. We are not partisan. We are I would say, a fiercely nonpartisan lobbying entity, as are most of our clients like AIA. But what we do is we work in a political world where there are realities that involve the majority, whatever party is in the majority, is more likely to get their bills passed than the party in the minority. And so what this shows, as you can see in the last year, in the 2021 session, if you had a Democrat patron for your bill, I'm just going to roughly say, you have a 67% chance of getting that passed versus a 31% chance. And so what we do when we're educating legislators, we are also trying to focus on our relationships and working with whatever party is in the majority on the specific issues that we're working on. Now, we have allies and champions for AIA Virginia on both sides of the aisle. And so I think in working on the issues over the past, 11, 12 years, I think 12 sessions, we have had equal success under Republican and Democratic control, because we work with all parties. But when it comes to getting a bill and getting it introduced, more often than not, we're going to be working with the party that's in power on that legislation.
Yeah, that's another reason why people hire lobbyists, because lobbyists know the personalities of the senators and delegates. And for example, we would know that even in a Republican-controlled General Assembly, that Democrat David Bulova is very well liked by everybody. And so we could have him carry a bill even in a Republican-controlled legislature. Whereas I won't, use names, but there are some people who are more partisan, and they won't go over very well carrying a bill in a chamber that's controlled by the other party. So you have to know the players.
Yep. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but these are some 5-year trends on the percentage of bills that passed. In any given legislative session, it's usually somewhere between 2,000 and 2,800 bills get introduced. This year, I think we had about 1,800, maybe 2,000, and 840 bills passed. So historically, it's been a little bit under 50% of bills that get introduced actually pass the General Assembly and signed into law. And believe it or not, there are a large number of bills that get passed with no opposition. So there is a lot of mundane work that gets done in the General Assembly. Of course, we hear about in the press and the media all the controversial stuff, but for every controversial bill that passes or gets killed, there's another 5 or 10 that really are not that controversial that move through the system.
Yeah, one thing to note, Patrick, on this chart, if you look at bills killed with no recorded vote, in some people might say, why was 2017 so big? It had a rule change. It used to be you could go send a bill to a subcommittee and just kill it without a recorded vote. And then the rules got changed which said that they had to have a recorded vote for certain types of motions. So that's just a basic rule change there, but it's pretty consistent. 30% get sent to subcommittee and just get killed.
Yeah, and I would say I mean, there's been believe it or not, a trend towards more transparency in the legislative process. That rule change that Dave mentioned was made by Republicans when they were in control. And we have also had, thanks to COVID, we now have all committee and subcommittee meetings are streaming online, and then they're recorded and archived so you can watch them. I mentioned earlier on that first photo that where Dave is doing the mic drop, we had 10 Republican legislators, and of that 10, only 3 were left in the General Assembly. There is a lot of turnover. I think when I look at the numbers in the House of Delegates, which has the fastest turnover because there's election every 2 years, when I calculate out to about an every 4-year cycle to compare it to the Senate, it's usually it's somewhere around 40% of the General Assembly is churned over every 4 years. So that's an additional 40 members over 2 election cycles that we need to educate on our issues. The Senate, the turnover is a little bit lower on a percentage basis, but you can see some of the swings in politics. And one of the trends that happens in Virginia, because we have our election the year after a presidential election, we are very reactive in Virginia to who is in office. And by reactive, we usually swing the opposite direction of whatever happens at the federal level. So you see a lot of Democrat losses in 2009, 2011, after Obama's second election. Then you have 2017 and 2019 with Trump in office, a swing back to Democratic control with a lot of Republican losses. So we see these swings happen and very influenced by who's in power at the federal level. Another infographic, General Assembly class of 2020. This just shows how I believe this is both the House and the Senate combined together in the last election. With the freshman class, you can see some changes in demographics of makeup of the General Assembly. Generally, I'd say on average, getting younger, more diverse, and more female. So, wanted to go through all of that to give you some of the background, and now we're going to move into some key tips, and I'll start by kind of highlighting what the AIA priorities are for advocacy. And I got to start by saying procurement remains a top priority. It's not so much at the state level, but at the local level, where you don't have the same level in many localities of the established professionals that do procurement on a day in and day out basis and have a large staff and knowledgeable. You have more financial pressures at the local level. We are constantly fighting bills that want to allow, in particular, local governments to procure architecture services through low bid. So we keep that as a top priority. But what we have done more of over the past several years is look at issues related to equity, energy, and the economy. School safety is a very big issue. I know Corey's done a great job at getting AIA out front in a number of legislative meetings, having members of the profession come and present on school safety and sustainability in school design. Those have been very well received. Resiliency and sustainability are two that really go hand in hand. And then housing access and affordability, another issue that we've spent some time working on over the past couple of years. Corey, anything that you want to highlight on the AIA advocacy issues and anything that may have changed or is on top of mind for you?
No, just I would say maybe K-12 outreach, and how do we begin to penetrate, maybe is the word, the curriculum. I think I shared with you, Patrick and Dave, that we have some lesson plans that we hired a consultant to correlate to the SOLs. And so from an outreach perspective, looking at ways we can work with the administration or legislators and getting architecture woven into K-12 curriculum.
Yeah, that's a great one. I didn't have that one in there.
I also thought, we found out last year through a report the governor made that the architect world is not very diverse. And so one of the things we were going to start working on is trying to find how we could increase diversity by getting young people of different backgrounds and colors and creeds and religions interested in architecture, so that when they get older, we have a more diverse body.
Yep, that's great. All right, so that's the bulk of our presentation. We're going to finish with a couple of key tips, because ultimately, for those of you that are watching, you'll be participating in the Architects Speak Up program, where Corey and AIA bring together legislators to have really a roundtable discussion on issues, find out what's important to those legislators, share what's important to the profession. And so we thought we would just go through a couple of key tips, and maybe it's not just Architects Speak Up. I think, our hope is that those that participate in Architects Speak Up might have a greater interest in communicating with their own legislator, or maybe one day participating in our joint legislative committee, which helps sets the legislative agenda for AIA. But one of the things is, we need legislators to know that architects are engaged in the public policy making process. Maybe I'll let Dave talk about the importance of relationships with constituents and the value that constituents bring to an advocacy campaign, where you have a lobbyist who's really talking to the legislator, but the component of the constituent. Dave.
I think a couple key things to remember about legislators that'll make all this will make sense if you remember a couple things. Number one, they're part-time. So when I was a legislator, I knew everything there was to know about criminal law in Virginia, but I knew nothing about architecture, about engineering, about building roads, about social services that I never had to receive. And the list goes on and on and on. They seek knowledge and they want to know. They don't have staffers. They have no one to give them information unless the lobbyists give them information or the constituents give them information. Point number two, the system is not broken, because what legislators care about is their constituents. Why? Because their constituents are the ones who vote for them. It would be hard for me to believe that if you called a legislator, that they wouldn't want to meet with you and listen to you at least. Doesn't mean they're going to agree, but they want you to contact them because they want you to be involved. So here's where the second bullet, relationships matter. You will always be able to meet with your delegate or senator. I guess maybe I shouldn't say always. 2% are kind of jerky, right? But everybody else will meet with you, and you start every kind of conversation you have from the time that you're emailing the first time or the time you're calling is, hi, my name's Dave and I am a constituent and I'd like to talk to you about architecture. Be yourself. Legislators are regular people. I mean, all of us are kind of weird, because who would ever run for office to, knock on doors for 3 hours a day for 7 months and raise $1 million and then subject yourself to having negative mail sent about you? So they're kind of a strange breed of people, but they are just regular people in your neighborhood. So you don't get nervous when you're talking to them. There's regular people. And you don't really want to get involved in politics when you're talking to people, because, if you're talking to a Democrat and you're a Republican or vice versa, then, they're not going to listen to you as much as if you were there as a person with a expertise in architecture.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key is stay focused on the issues of AIA Virginia. You may have, and we work with all legislators, and staying focused on the issues for your profession. I mean, there really shouldn't be any issues with that. So I mean, tons of lobbyists who are far more partisan than Dave and I, and legislators know it. These are all, for the most part, again, minus the 2% that Dave mentioned, they're great people, and politics, when it comes to meeting with their constituents, politics don't matter.
Yeah, this share projects, we haven't looked at these slides in a year, and I remember doing that because picture is 1,000 words. If you can describe something or a problem and give an example, that really helps the legislator understand what you're talking about. Yeah, and so also the next one, make sure to ask questions, keep the dialogue balanced. I mean, this is a discussion between you and the legislator, so it's not just you telling them everything you know. It's also you listening and taking questions and trying to answer. This is, don't discuss campaign contributions. We already went over that. And then we just talked about recognizing you're on behalf of the AIA. If you want to go yell at the legislator on a guns or abortion, set a separate appointment.
Yeah. I think that's kind of where I was going on the political front. But look, I mean, with Architects Speak Up, it's a great opportunity to start building that relationship. And anytime that Corey or Dave or I are helping facilitate or encouraging you to meet with your legislator, we're really doing that to provide a face to the name for the profession. So really the value is providing that education to the legislator on what you do, listening to what they're concerned with. When it comes to asking legislators to take certain positions on bills, that's going to be Dave and I and Corey. So you guys don't have to worry about that.
I can tell you a story from my days. I remember a bill came up on certified public accountants, and one CPA from my district called me. Hey, Dave, I live in your district. I'm a CPA. Here's why I think this bill is a good idea. No one else talked to me about it. And when it came to the House floor, I said, well, I'm voting with my constituent. That guy basically had a vote on the floor of the Virginia General Assembly because he took the time to call his legislator and let me know what he thinks. And a lot of times when constituents call and they ask me to vote a certain way, and I end up thinking that maybe it's better to vote the opposite, it takes a lot for me to do that because I know I'm going to have to write a personal email or a letter to the constituent saying why I did not support their position.
Yep. All right. So with that, we've got a few minutes left over. If anybody has any questions, Corey, you can moderate this, or Rhea, but I think either the chat box or live are fine with us.
Certainly. And first, let me say thank you both to Patrick and Dave for coming in. Whenever I call, this is above and beyond your scope of services. So whenever I call, you guys have always picked up the phone. And when I say you're truly an extension of our organization, this is exactly what I mean. So I just want to say thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. Any questions that you've heard thus far from Advocacy 101, this great presentation? Feel free to come off the camera and begin to speak.
Okay. I think that's it. Corey, you might be frozen, so I'm gonna take the liberty of saying that I think that's it. If I've got Dave and I's contact info up there, obviously Corey and Rhea are available. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks for your time today.
Yep,
Good to
you're
do it.
welcome.
We'll see y'all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Hey, I think we might have lost Corey, so this is Rhea over here. One other person, Michael, if you've got a member number you could drop into the chat, that would be great, because we've got a couple of Michael Lawsons in Virginia. I want to make sure you're getting all the credit you deserve for attending. For those that attended the session last year, which I think is Amanda and Allison, thanks for coming in for this refresher. It doesn't offer credit for a session that you've taken within about a year or so, but if you've got any questions, you can always shoot me an email. And I think Corey is back on the line, so I'll turn things back over to him. Okay, Corey may still be having some difficulty with his video or audio. Corey, you back on?
I think so. I think
Great.
so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think that brings us to a conclusion today. I apologize for the technical difficulties I'm having with the Wi-Fi here. But thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at Architects Speak Up.